Good morning, everyone. My name is Larry Parker. I'm the head of mergers and acquisitions at Williams Mullen, and I'm here today with my colleague Bryden DeWitt, who is an attorney in our employee benefits section. And we're going to present on employee benefits considerations and mergers and acquisitions. Rebecca, go ahead and advance for me. Before we get going, a couple housekeeping items. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that to submit questions. We will answer your questions at the end, time permitting. If we don't get to your question, we will reach out to you directly after the presentation. Also, if you're having any audio or technical problems, please use that same Q&A button to reach out to us, and we'll help you resolve them. You'll receive a copy of the presentation materials and a link to the program after we present later this afternoon. Well, here are the three topics we're going to present on today, and I'm going to ask Bryden a couple questions to get this going. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So, how does pension plan withdrawal liability affect potentially impact your transaction?
Oh, thank you, Larry, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. The first topic that we're going to talk about is multi-employer pension plan withdrawal liability in the context of mergers and acquisitions. And first, we have to understand what a multi-employer pension plan is. And so these are collectively bargained pension plans run by a union. They're union pension plans where several employers have obligations through collective bargaining agreements to contribute to and participate in this plan, multi-employer pension plans. These plans provide defined benefits that are based on typically years of service, years of credited service multiplied by a dollar amount. Collective bargaining agreements require the participating employers to contribute to the plan. And so this is what we're talking about as far as a multi-employer pension plan. Because these are defined benefit plans that guarantee employees or the participating employees defined benefits at retirement, ERISA protects these plans by having this concept called withdrawal liability. And what withdrawal liability is there for is when an employer withdraws from a multi-employer plan, either they permanently cease to have an obligation to contribute to the plan, or they stop covered obligations under the plan and no longer have workers who are covered by the collective bargaining agreement, or if there's even a partial withdrawal, a 70% decline in contributions to the plan, or partial cessation of the employer's contribution or requirement to contribute to the plan, then ERISA imposes what's known as withdrawal liability if the plan is underfunded. And so this is intended to help the plan, allow the plan to provide benefits to participating employees to the extent that when the employer withdrew from the plan, those benefit liabilities were not fully funded. They were underfunded. And withdrawal liability can be a significant amount of money to cover the unfunded vested benefits under the plan for the employers, withdrawing employees. And significantly, all members of an employer's control group, so the employers that are together under common ownership, are jointly and severally liable for the withdrawal liability. So if you have a parent company, company A, and there are three subsidiaries, B, C, and D, and only D has a collective bargaining agreement, and only subsidiary D has withdrawal liability. If D doesn't pay the withdrawal liability, the other members of the control group, A, B, and C, can be jointly and severally liable for the withdrawal liability. So we can go to the next slide. So this impacts mergers and acquisitions. So in an asset transaction, the asset transaction itself is probably going to result in withdrawal liability because the seller is ceasing operations, the seller is selling a business, the assets of a business, the employees are being terminated. That will result in withdrawal liability if those employees are collectively bargained and the employer is participating in the multi-employer plan. So that will trigger withdrawal liability. So if you're a seller, you have to understand if you're selling the assets of a business that it could, and the business is participating in a multi-employer plan, that can result in withdrawal liability. For the buyer, there's also risk. I mean, even though it's an asset deal, and often you don't think that the liabilities of the seller in an asset deal become liabilities of the buyer, but courts have recognized successor liability for withdrawal liability in asset deals, where the buyer was aware of the issue, aware of the potential withdrawal liability, and the buyer is continuing the business operations of the assets. Courts have held that the buyer, in that case, can be held liable for withdrawal liability if the seller fails to pay the withdrawal liability. So it's an issue for both the buyer and the seller in an asset transaction. And then also, as we go on to an equity transaction, onto the next slide, for the seller, the transaction itself likely is not going to result in withdrawal liability because the business is remaining intact. The target company will remain subject to the collective bargaining agreement and continue to have an obligation to contribute to the multi-employer plan. What the buyer has to realize is you are now bringing into your control group an entity that has obligations under the CBA. So the continued obligation or the obligation to contribute to the plan will continue post-transaction. And then once that entity is a member of your control group, all members of the control group again are jointly and severally liable for withdrawal liability. So if the target company that was acquired is participating in a multi-employer plan, and then an event occurs, if that entity withdraws from the plan, all members of the control group could be held jointly and severally liable for any withdrawal liability. So this is why in every purchase agreement, whether it's an asset deal or a stock deal, we always have language. We have a rep that says that the seller does not and has not participated in a multi-employer pension plan. And that's why we have this language to flag this issue and make sure that we are aware the risk that are associated with withdrawal liability in a deal. So we can go to the next slide.
So what about COBRA, Brad? And who's responsible for supplying coverage when a company is sold?
So this is another issue that's been coming up a lot. And I think most people are familiar with COBRA. It's a federal law that requires a group health plan coverage to be provided to terminated employees for 18 months after when they lose coverage due to a termination of employment. This comes up in transactions because you have employees who are leaving, who are no longer eligible for the seller's plan. And basically the rule is that either whether it's an equity deal or an asset deal, if the seller ceases to provide a group health plan to employees, and in an asset deal, if the buyer continues the business operations of the seller with respect to the sold assets, then the obligation to provide COBRA continuation coverage to M&A qualified beneficiaries shifts to the buyer. So when the seller ceases to offer a group health plan, the obligation to provide COBRA shifts to the buyer. And M&A qualified beneficiaries are, of course, employees and their spouses and dependents who lose coverage in connection with the sale. So if you're selling the assets and the employees lose their job, they lose coverage under the health plan, those are M&A qualified beneficiaries. And if their spouses and dependents lose coverage, those are M&A qualified beneficiaries. But M&A qualified beneficiaries is also defined to include anyone who was on COBRA at the time of the transaction. So if you had an employee who was his employment terminated 6 months prior to the transaction and is on COBRA, that individual is an M&A qualified beneficiary. So it's not just the immediate employees impacted by the transaction, but anyone who is on COBRA at the time of the transaction is an M&A qualified beneficiary to whom coverage has to be provided. And if the seller stops offering a group health plan, that obligation shifts to the buyer. Now, the parties in the transaction, the regulations allow the parties to a transaction to change this result. So in the purchase agreement, the shifting of obligations, the responsibility for COBRA can be altered. The regulations provide a default rule, but you can provide for a different outcome in the agreement. And so we can go to the next slide. And another issue that's come up lately that I've seen, and is really a significant issue in a recent deal, is the Affordable Care Act. And so, of course, the Affordable Care Act was passed 10 years ago. We're all pretty familiar with it. It requires applicable large employers with at least 50 full-time employees, to offer affordable minimum value coverage to 95% of their full-time employees. If an employer fails to do this, the penalty for 2022 is $229 per month per full-time employee in excess of 30 employees. That's a monthly penalty that applies if the employer failed to offer any group health plan coverage to employees. If the employer offered group health plan coverage, but the coverage failed the affordability requirement or failed the minimum value requirement, then the penalty is $343.33 per month for each employee who receives a premium tax credit through the ACA marketplace. So the 4980HB penalty only applies per employee who goes to the ACA exchange or marketplace, purchases coverage, and qualifies for the premium tax credit. So this can be significant because you have to be sure through diligence that you identify whether the employer met these requirements. The buyer needs to ask the seller, whether minimum affordable group health coverage was offered to at least 95% of full-time employees. And if so, how did they identify full-time employees? The regulations provide two different methods, a monthly measurement method and a look-back method. If they're complying with the ACA, they should know which method they're using for identifying full-time employees. And then also ask them, how was affordability measured? There are three safe harbors. It can be based on the W-2 compensation, on their rate of pay, or the federal poverty line. But the issue here is if the employer failed to offer affordable coverage, quantifying the risk is very difficult because the risk is only based on the number of employees who went to the exchange and qualified for the premium tax credit. The IRS is about 2 or 3 years behind on assessing these penalties. So there could have been an issue if you're acquiring a company today. There could have been an issue in 2021. We're not going to know what the employer shared responsibility payment is until the IRS assesses it, which could be 2 years from now. So it's really an unknown risk. It's important in a deal to make sure that the employer understood its obligation and met its obligation under the ACA, because this can be a very significant liability if the employer failed to comply.
So Bryden, does the ACA compliance liability apply in an asset deal as well?
I mean, there is a theory of successor liability for tax obligations, but I see it really more as an issue in an equity transaction where you really are concerned that you're going to inherit a problem if the selling group didn't understand its ACA the ACA requirements, if it didn't offer affordable coverage, if it didn't understand how to identify full-time employees. There could be a hidden liability that we're not going to really know for sure what that liability is until the IRS assesses it.
Well, Stephanie, did we get any questions in the Q&A?
We don't have any new questions right now. No, not yet.
Okay, well, hearing none, then we'll go ahead and wrap. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Bryden, for an excellent presentation. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact info is on the screen, and we will reply. Thank you again. Have a good day.